Okay, anyone else left? Okay, I think we've covered everyone, and the purpose of that is actually for me to understand how to plan the delivery, and now I have fair understanding that we have individuals joining in from banking, finance, leasing, and insurance broadly, and there are obviously various reasons why you joined the program. One is to enhance knowledge, maybe to advance your career. Some are also from compliance function itself. So it's going to be an engaging session. And like I said at the first session, it's adult learning, and adult education is all about learning from each other. So it's not going to be a one-way delivery. Let's make sure that it is engaging as possible. How I'm going to structure this is, there are two components of this, right? One is you should be able to pass the exam. And what should you do to pass the exam is few things, right? There is no way without reading the textbook to get through the exam. You need textbook is fundamentally the most important aspect of it, right? So what we are going to do is we are going to cover, I have intentionally had slides covering details. It's so if I may share my slide now, give me a second. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see. Yes.
We can see.
Yeah, so what I have done is I have prepared the slides directly from the textbook itself, right? So these slides can be used as a guide later on, if in case you want to use these slides as a part of revision. So few things to remember, you need to, has everyone got the textbook already, or it's in the process of?
It's in the process.
Not
It's
yet.
in the
Yeah.
not yet. So
Actually, we received session 1 and 2, chapter 1 and 2 through email.
Okay, great. So today we are covering chapter 2, which is the compliance function. And I will also be covering managing financial crime risk as well. So I'll explain how these chapters are going to be scheduled over the next 5 weeks or so. So again, going back to the topic of two things. One is passing the exam. Second is gaining some knowledge and practical experience, right? So so we will be focusing on both, and because it's critical that we focus on both, right? So starting point is it's important that you read the textbook. If you read the text ahead of joining the class, anything that is being discussed in the class may sound familiar to you, and it will really help you to get better understanding and ask questions and have practical application to it as well. And the third thing that I want to highlight is when you do the exam, so when you look at compliance function, this is directly from how it is managed from a global context, more close to how it is managed from a UK perspective, right? So CISI is a UK qualification. And so some of the practical aspect of what you see in Sri Lanka may not directly translate into what is in the textbook, right? So why I say that is because when you answer an exam question, that should be from the textbook, right? And it might be in your bank or finance company done slightly differently, but your response should be from textbook. So keep that in mind. Sometimes you might feel, oh, this question is so easy because it's second nature to you having seen that at office, but that may not be the correct answer as well. So those things keep in mind. So, all right, any questions at this point before we start off?
Shane,
No.
what would be our exam window?
Sorry?
What would be our window for the exam?
So it's basically once the session is over, whenever you are ready, you can take the exam, right? What we would recommend is we do not recommend for you to take a long time, because then you're not fresh off memory of the studies you've completed. So it will be better for you to complete as soon as the sessions are over, right? But it's at the discretion of you to set the exam.
Okay, is it like open time frame, or is there any particular time frame to apply for the exams? Let's say
That of course I will let the academy respond. Is Himali or Kapila online?
Yes, sir.
Himali, there is a question whether there is a timeline to apply for the exam.
No timeline, sir. Anytime they're ready, they can apply for the
So
exam.
any time is okay, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So last batch also we've had few who completed very early as soon as the session is over, but some who finished maybe about 3-4 months after the session was completed. But everyone, I think majority completed within 3 months of finishing the lessons.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
100% pass mark.
Yep. So that was what was told to me, and I saw some, because we are in a WhatsApp group as well. So I saw people sharing updates about passing. So it's all good when it works out fine. So again, something that you should have a decent timeline in mind as you progress. So look, I have 5 sessions up front. So that 5 sessions, the first 2 sessions are going to be about the compliance function, and the remaining 3 sessions are going to be about managing financial crime. So that is chapter 2 and chapter 3 of your textbook. So to start off with, can I ask you, what is the difference between risk and compliance? Anyone? You can give it a try. There is no harm in getting it wrong.
Risk is to do with managing potential losses or and compliance is to ensure that you act in accordance with regulations, again as a part of mitigating regulatory penalties and regulatory repercussions.
Yeah, that's exactly the correct answer. So I can't see who answered because I'm on this share screen mode.
I'm Gunashant.
Gunashant, that's exactly the correct answer, right?
I'm
So
Gunashant.
risk and compliance is oftentimes used interchangeably. They are very closely aligned, but they are different different specialities, right? So like risk, we'll look at a probability of an event and try to manage that eventuality. And if you look at compliance, is again, starting point is conforming with the requirements set forth by a regulatory body, right? Or complying with the laws, regulations that an organization should operate within. So the emphasis on compliance actually significantly increased as a result of 2 key events which happened in 2001 and 2002 respectively. You would have heard the cases of Enron and WorldCom, right? So those were basically 2 largest corporate accounting scandals. And anyone familiar with it? Anyone who have heard about it? At least the name, has anyone heard Enron and WorldCom?
Yes.
Enron, like they were using like kind of special purpose entities to hide financial entries, right?
Yeah, so that's correct. So Enron was actually a Houston-based commodities, energy, and a service corporation. And what exactly happened was about they basically cooked the books, and as a result of it, shareholders lost about 74 billion funds, right? So they kept huge debts off balance sheet, and that was not visible for a long time. Similarly, WorldCom was also a case of inflating assets, and the overall loss was about 11 billion, and also 30,000 jobs were lost as a result, right? So prior to fun fact is prior to Enron scandal being uncovered, Fortune magazine actually named Enron as America's most innovative company 6 years in a row. So that at that time, the level of transparency, requirement for compliance, etc., was not as strong as it is today, right? So those two events basically shaped a lot of changes subsequently. So why I said that was, so when we move on to the section, so before that, I'll just quickly highlight this. So out of this section, you will get 24 questions approximately, right? So it's an important area. And even though you have 5 sections, you can understand this section has 24 questions. So moving on to, you'd have heard this term called compliance starts from the top, right? But it is everyone's responsibility. So in your own organizations, how do you see this happening? Especially the tone from the top, right? You don't have to specifically go into nitty-gritties, but any good examples, or even in organizations that you've heard, any good examples that you can quote?
I think what we can see is compliance risk is identified as one of the key risks in the financial sector, and I think there's a due weightage given on that and monitoring, according to the given laws. That's what I can say.
Yeah, so in an organization where compliance starts from the top, usually few things happen, right? So compliance has a place in the main table, right? And compliance's voice is heard. People don't fear to speak up about things that are not in accordance to what it should be. And a culture of speak up is fostered. And also, there is a level of independence for the function of compliance, right? So if you look at compliance, it starts from the top. It is a responsibility of everyone in the organization. So oftentimes people think compliance is a responsibility of the compliance function alone, but that is not the case. Compliance is the responsibility of everyone. And compliance function will basically look at it from an overall perspective and drive 2 key responsibilities. That is, firstly, to assess and monitor the adequacy and the effectiveness of the measures and procedures put in place. So effective monitoring program. Secondly, to advise and assist people who are actually carrying out regulatory related activities, right? So those are the 2 main responsibilities of the compliance function. Whilst its tone starts from top, whilst it's everyone's responsibility, compliance has 2 key responsibilities. One is to have an effective monitoring program, and secondly, to provide solid and adequate advice. So when you say reinforcing tone from the top, few good measures that people look at is, does the leaders in your organization walk the talk? If you say, for an example, if a particular particular business deal is going to bring an outcome that generates significant revenue, but that is as a result of customers being incorrectly advised of product features and customers entering into a contract with the bank without properly understanding, will the leaders in your organization have the courage to say no to a deal? Right, and that's basically not only the compliance function's responsibility. And secondly, if something of that nature is happening, will the compliance function have adequate independence and authority to challenge such business decisions, right? So in your respective organizations, you can always look at, does the leaders walk the talk, right? And is it reflected? And another way to look at it is you have to have a close sort of ear on the ground. What does staff think about the culture of the organization? What does social media, what would external parties think about the culture of the organization? Is it known to do the right thing, or is it known to make profits at compromising the regulations? So it's something that you can reflect when you're looking at the tone from the top. Again, the other thing is reward is based on principle of performance, right? And so we oftentimes reward individuals when they bring in sales, when they achieve sales outcomes. But how often does an organization reward someone when there is a fantastic customer outcome as a result of proper compliance of a procedure or proper explanation of a product or having great conduct outcomes, right? So these are elements that shapes up a good compliance program. So I said compliance is not the responsibility of a specialist compliance function. Compliance needs to be embedded within the firm and it should be a part of its culture, right? So you can now reflect on certain instances in the past where some instance where you thought maybe the culture of the organization didn't actually reflect good governance or the compliance standards that we aspire to, right? Or maybe you can reflect saying that in this instance, we have actually demonstrated that our culture is a strong compliance culture that we have, and we've done adequate measures to make sure that we comply with the laws, regulations, as well as create good customer outcomes, right? So that's just for your reflection. So moving on. Moving on to the responsibilities of the board, right? So this is basically the first principle of the Basel Committee for Bank Supervision. So Basel Committee for Bank Supervision had 10 principles for the compliance function, and one of it is the responsibilities of the board. So it's actually the starting principle for a compliance function. So if you look at the board is responsible for overseeing and managing compliance risk, right? Approve the firm's compliance policy. At least once a year, the board committee should assess the extent to which the firm is managing its compliance obligation. Board should promote the values of honesty, integrity throughout the organization. This is where the culture comes in, right? Board should ensure compliance issues are solved by management in a timely manner, right? So this is the first principle of the Basel Committee for Bank Supervision's first principle for compliance function. So if you look at the textbook doesn't necessarily go through 1 to 10 principles at a stretch, but what I will do is I will share you the 10 principles in a separate document subsequent to this session today, so that you can have a quick read through. So first principle is responsibility of the board. Any guesses what the second principle is? Second principle is the responsibility of the senior management. So an effective management of compliance risk, establishing and communicating a compliance policy for ensuring that it should be observed, and for reporting to the board of directors on the management of compliance risk. So that is the responsibility of your senior management. Then senior management should also identify, assess main compliance risk, of course, with the support of the compliance function, and at least once a year report to the board and committee of the board how compliance risk is managed within the organization. Report promptly to the board of any failures and keep the board informed, right? And any questions so far? Okay, I'll take that as no. So the sixth principle of Basel Committee's bank supervision is the adequacy of resources, right? So if you look at compliance, if you look at the compliance function should be sufficiently resourced, not only in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality, right? Whether they have adequate qualifications, experience, professional and personal qualities to enable them to carry out specific compliance duties, right? Again, certain unique characteristics of individuals within compliance function is like the example, personal qualities, right? So if someone doesn't like to read much, then it's obviously a challenge to be in the compliance function, right? Because for the simple reason, compliance requires reading a lot of regulations, reading a lot of policies and procedures that come from various areas of the bank, for an example, and then you'll have to review it to see if they are compliant with the regulation. So that personal attributes also matter in terms of you developing a compliance function and a team, right? And the third thing is good understanding of the compliance laws, rules, and the standards, and their practical impact to the firm's operation, right? So if, for an example, a lot of times when a compliance function is working closely with businesses, right? So I'm going to quote examples from a bank's perspective. So if you are working with maybe retail banking, corporate banking, they will always want to know what is the overall regulatory direction, right? And for an example, I mean, in my experience from Sri Lanka, I remember when there was a regulation that came where export proceeds, a certain component of export proceeds had to be converted on a mandatory basis and also again repatriated back to central bank, right? So when that came through, the level of detail, complying with the regulation and working with lines of businesses was, so some of it, lines of businesses, when they do work with the compliance, they want us to provide the advice in terms of having the minimal impact on the customer. So it's between balancing the regulation and the impact to the customers. And where there are significant impact to the customers, either the compliance function will carry that information back to the regulator. And the priority is to meet the regulatory requirement. But if there is significant impact, there is always that feedback loop through compliance back to the regulator, so that certain changes can happen. Anyone who has experienced, given the current context in Sri Lanka, anyone that has experienced recent regulations having a significant impact on customers, anything that can get called out? Anyone from a bank compliance team? There were few of you, right? Okay, so
Sorry, sir.
yeah, go ahead.
I'm actually not attached to compliance, but however, I'm on the other side of the coin because we at corporate banking, we want compliance sometimes to give us the right direction in terms of, educating our clients. So I think I've experienced that what you told just now on export proceeds.
Yeah, so that's the other challenge, right? Now, if you look at compliance as a function, sometimes you get squeezed in from both parties, right? One is the regulator, one is the businesses, right? You are right in the middle. You are expected to provide good outcomes and solutions that are beneficial, but also comply with the regulation, right? And so it's really important that as a compliance officer, the role has also evolved. So back in the day, compliance officers are only expected to be very strict, and it's like compliance is like a function that says no to everything, right? They look at the manual and they say no to everything. But that role also has evolved now. People are more and more expected to be even in compliance, business centered, understand businesses slightly better, and also ensure that the firm's interest is very well secured in as far as the regulatory relationship and also the compliance to regulations is concerned. So that's about adequacy of resources, and the other aspect is the independence. So compliance function should be independent. Compliance function should have a seat in the top table, and whether the compliance officer is of the authority to challenge certain decisions taken even at an executive committee level, whether this individual compliance officer is in a position to challenge. So that level of authority is required for the compliance officers. So moving on, so if you look at the compliance manual, so before we go to this slide, what do you understand by a compliance manual, and in your respective organizations, what is a compliance manual?
It's how the law is being practically applied.
Okay.
Which spells out what checks and balances to perform when you're doing your verifications and reviews.
Okay. Okay. So this is where an instance where I said sometimes the text is slightly different from a practical aspect, right? So for us, compliance manual could actually be a procedure manual where practical steps are there, how you should comply with the laws, regulations, and also how employees should have employees' personal conduct should be followed, and what sort of way in which the business should be operated, right? So as far as the text is concerned, compliance manual is not a procedure manual. It's a policy or a guidance, right? So it's a high level policy or a guidance document. It's not a procedure manual. So the fact that it's a policy or a procedure is, in practical terms, is used interchangeably and is also applied depending on the organization. But what you need to remember is, for the purpose of the exam and the text, compliance manual is a policy or a guidance. It's at a high level. It's like an umbrella that covers all the areas, but it's just that does not spell out exactly like a procedure in detail what steps to take, right? But it will spell out what needs to be done. So if you go to the next slide, the purpose of the manual is to formally document the standards to be followed by all employees in their personal conduct and in conducting business with customers and counterparties. Expands on corporate governance manual and on matters relating to compliance, right? Legal regulatory obligations of employees, contracted agents. Then, hello, I think we might have to ask someone to go on mute. I think Gunashant. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Then the other important aspect about the compliance manual is the fact that staff should be aware of the contents in the manual, and this manual should be accessible by staff, right? More often than not, when auditors come to audit or even the regulatory examination is happening, accessibility of the compliance manual to staff is been oftentimes questioned, right? So that you should keep that in mind as well. Then we move on to the scope of the compliance manual.
So I have a question. Can I
Yeah.
interrupt?
Yeah, sure.
So, yeah, now when you take some application of any policy or whatever, so policy will say, you know, this is whatever A, B, C, D. When the procedure will talk about the application of it, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So can you go back to the earlier slide?
This one.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this point before the last one, the manual is not a procedure, but rather provide policy and guidance. So, I mean, bit difficult to understand where does that line is exactly drawn.
Yeah. So if you look at the compliance manual usually says what to do, right? And it doesn't spell out how exactly to do it, right? So basically what needs to be done, what is the expectation broadly, this is what we want to achieve, right? But if you look at the procedure will explain exactly the steps that you need to complete in order to get there, right? In a practical context, when you say sometimes compliance manuals, policy, procedure, everything is there in certain organizations, right? But in certain organizations, the policy is separate and there are certain operating instructions. You might call it the desk instruction or an operating instruction or a standard operating procedure, something explaining more detail, right? So for the purpose of the exam, compliance policy or compliance manual is a policy, right? It's not a procedure. It doesn't detail out what exactly the steps you should take.
Okay, okay, got it. Thanks.
Okay, so this is again, like I said, this is directly from the text, right? So I have also been conscious not to put anything that I have personally experienced as well, because the whole point of having it from the text itself is so that when you do revision, you use this as a revision guide. This will basically cover everything that you would read on the textbook. All right, thanks for the question, and that's good. When you can interrupt me at any time and ask questions as well, so no problem. So we move on to the scope of the manual. So we discussed this very briefly. It covers high-level overview of rules and regulations and also the regulatory bodies governing the firm. The firm operates, if a firm operates internationally, there could be instances where the regulatory bodies could be not only limited to the country, but to any jurisdiction that they have authority over, right? So if it's a multinational bank, in certain instances, if your head office is in a particular country, and your branch operations or branches are in a different country, you'll obviously have to comply with certain regulations from the head office regulator as well as the country that you're operating in. Then thirdly, usually the manual will be a very live document. It's not a standard document. Why is it live? Is because the regulatory environment keeps changing, and as a result, you'll have to keep changing the manual in order to meet the current regulatory requirement, right? And the other thing is, when staff understand certain gaps, staff will also provide feedback, and then those need to get reflected as well. So that's the scope of the manual, which we briefly discussed as well. Okay, so moving on to communicating the formal status of the compliance function. So again, this is from the Basel Committee for Bank Supervision, right? I have also highlighted the fact that there should be a formal status for the compliance function. It should be independent, it should be adequately resourced, it should have a level of authority, right? So that's where the formal status comes from, right? Compliance policy needs to include in the induction and on other relevant training. So again, does your organization, if you look at the induction program, does your organization have compliance, a session for compliance in your induction programs? Anyone from banks?
Yes, we do.
So basically compliance is already covered in your induction program.
Correct.
Anyone who has an induction program that compliance is not an agenda? You don't have to tell the name of the organization, but if compliance is not a part of the induction program, I think it's good if you can suggest compliance to be a part of the induction program. And it again will demonstrate the culture and the governance that an organization would have, right? I'd be really surprised if compliance is not, given the emphasis and the current context. But if it's not, and if you have a good speak up culture and you bringing up an idea will be welcomed, I think you should go ahead and suggest that compliance should be a part of the induction program. So again, we're looking at the compliance manual and some of the contents of the manual, right? So compliance manual will at a high level say the roles and responsibilities, measures to ensure independence, its relationship with other risk management functions. This is very specifically relating to audit. It's access to right to obtain information, right? So can compliance function request for information from other functions in your own organizational experiences?
Yes, they can.
Yeah, so there is a right to obtain access to information, right to conduct investigations of possible breaches, right to be able to freely express and disclose its finding to senior management and board, right? Formal reporting obligation to the senior management, right to direct access to the board of directors. So in that board meeting, usually compliance is a representative, right? And will play a critical role. So in your own organizations, and I'm assuming that organizations that have a board of directors, any experience that you can share, anything that you can explain from your own organizational experience? Anyone? or is everyone busy watching the cricket match? I was going to tell Kapila, is it a good day to have the class also? Any experience that you can share from your organization?
Shane, I think it depends. Basically, when it comes to, I think banks, they do have a kind of a very sound overlooking by the board. But when it comes to certain other companies, especially the sector I am in, which is the leasing companies, probably the emphasis is not that much as a bank do. But yes, they do. But as I said, the level of emphasis may differ.
May differ, right? So yeah, I mean, I guess if you look at a bank in comparison to maybe a leasing company or an insurance company, bank compliance will be relatively higher. So we are looking at what an effective compliance function would look like, right? So if you look at two key responsibilities I highlighted, any idea about the two key responsibilities of the compliance function? Simple way to remember is one is monitoring, second is advising, right? Monitoring the business and its compliance to regulations, and advising people who are actually operating, as well as advising to the senior management, right? And a well-run compliance function can be a competitive advantage. So back in the day, you used to look at compliance function as a function that restricts business. Now that view has completely changed. In a global context, that view has completely changed because compliance helps to build a stronger brand. Compliance helps to build stronger reputation, and that effectively attracts more business, right? Take this for an example. If you are a bank and if you are known to be a bank that doesn't have strong compliance, would depositors be attracted? I would say, would intelligent depositors be attracted to your organization? Because if you think that even given the current context, if you think that a bank doesn't have strong compliance with regulations, would you be attracted? So in a global context now, it's been seen as compliance will drive competitive advantage and helps build stronger brands, stronger reputations, and then that effectively will attract more business, right? So a strong compliance function will provide assurance to the board and the senior management. And this can happen in various forms, right? This can happen through the monitoring program that they have already in place. And as a result of the monitoring program, they will subsequently report the observations to the board, either to say that we have identified X, Y, and Z gaps and we are fixing, or we will say we will go and say we have completed this review and no material concerns have been identified.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, you said there are two key responsibilities for the compliance function. One is to monitor and the other to advise. And reporting, doesn't it come, report to the board? Doesn't it come under a key responsibility?
So that forms a part of the broad advice piece.
Okay, right.
Yeah. So thanks for the question. So again, identify and record good and bad practices, provide feedback on failures in control, and provide recommendations, right? And also provide analysis of early warning on regulatory change. So this is a very critical piece for businesses, right? If you look at compliance, front-running regulations, and proactively giving advice to the businesses. When I say businesses, either it's retail, corporate, business, that will be really value adding, and then that demonstrate the compliance function has a very close relationship with the regulators, and they can sense the regulatory direction and they can shape business in a way to be more prepared for the regulatory changes, right? Then effective compliance function will have a good and an open relationship with the regulator. When you say build a good and an open relationship, that relationship is mutually beneficial. It's not a one-way communication from the regulator to the compliance function, but the compliance function will also work hand in hand with the regulator in terms of providing expertise to the regulator and from based on an experience that they have in maybe another market. So if you take an international bank that operates in multiple countries, there is a huge opportunity for them to work with regulators in terms of shaping the regulatory environment. If you look at banks that operate in multiple countries, means that certain countries have advanced regulatory framework and certain countries have a progressive regulatory framework. So there's always opportunity to learn from countries that have an advanced regulatory framework and how that information is passed on, right? So that also helps to build relationship and also helps to build credibility with the regulator. And then where relevant, respond and coordinate responses to proposed legislation or regulations with a view to achieving the regulation. So certain times regulators share draft regulations and those regulations come to the banks. Then banks will provide through the compliance function an opinion about the regulation and the practical implications of it, and then share feedback on the draft. And then subsequently the regulator will consider the feedback and then issue the regulation. In your experience, does this happen now in the context of Sri Lanka? Sorry? Hello? Hello? Was that a question or?
So what's the question? Sorry, I didn't get it.
No, the question is now I refer to regulators issuing draft regulations and asking for feedback. Does this happen in the context of Sri Lanka? Have you seen that happening?
I have seen they release it, and then sometimes when we go back with the question and answer, sometimes they issue amendments, to certain points.
Yeah, actually, I was actually going to get to that point, right? I mean, if you look at about
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
There are instances there where they refer not actually draft regulation. I can quote one example, setting like calculation of weekly PLR. So they wanted to regulate the mechanism of calculations, that is all the banks on a last day of the particular week. They report their own calculation to the central bank, and on the following Monday, based on the information given by the banks, they set up the PLR for the ensuing week. So to regulate that, they wanted ideas of the banks, and then only they came up with the real regulation, whatever the guideline to follow. I know, was it your question?
Yeah, no. I just wanted to understand. I mean, I think in my own experience, if you look at about 3-4 years back, I think there was more of a draft coming in. But considering the environment we operate in and maybe the urgency of issuing regulations, now it's more the regulation being issued and the practical aspect only comes in the form of Q&A, and then regulations are being adjusted. It's just me comparing probably about four years of how probably it would have happened. My own personal reflections.
In most of the cases, they come up with the regulation. Maybe they don't get a feedback from the banks or whatever the stakeholders, and then come up with the regulation. But to answer your question, there are instances where they do, Shane.
Great. All right. So should we take a break and come back in like 10 minutes? Or do you want to continue and probably finish about 15 minutes early? Okay, no answer means it'll be good to take a 10-minute break, right?